The Mummy, 2017. The Mummy is a 2017 American action-adventure horror film produced by Universal Pictures, one of the oldest and most influential film studios in Hollywood, based in the United States. The film was directed by Alex Kurtzman, an American filmmaker and screenwriter who had previously built his career largely through writing and producing rather than directing, and this project marked one of his most high-profile directing efforts. The Mummy was conceived as far more than a simple reboot of a beloved franchise. It was designed by Universal as the official launching point of what the studio called the Dark Universe, an ambitious plan to build a connected cinematic world around its classic monster characters such as Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and the Bride of Frankenstein, much in the way Marvel Studios had built its own interconnected universe of superhero films. Universal Pictures, being an American studio with a very long history dating back to the earliest days of cinema, had originally introduced audiences to characters like the Mummy in black and white horror classics decades earlier, and this new version was meant to reintroduce those characters to a modern audience while tying them all together in one shared cinematic continuity. The film itself was shot primarily in the United Kingdom, with significant production work taking place in Oxfordshire, London, and various other locations in England, alongside additional filming in Namibia to capture the desert sequences representing the Middle East. Although the story is set partly in Iraq and partly in London, the actual physical production of the movie took place mainly on British soil, which is a common practice in modern Hollywood filmmaking where locations are chosen for practical, financial, and logistical reasons rather than strict geographical accuracy. The screenplay went through several hands over the years of development, eventually being credited to David Koepp, Christopher McQuarrie, and Dylan Cussman, with a story credit shared between John Spates, Alex Kurtzman, and Jenny Lumet. This layered writing process reflects how much the project evolved before finally reaching the screen, as Universal wanted to make sure the film could carry the weight of launching an entire new franchise. The producers behind the film included Alex Kurtzman himself along with Chris Morgan, Sean Daniel, and Sarah Bradshaw, all seasoned figures in the industry with experience shaping big-budget action and adventure films. The cinematography was handled by Ben Saracen, whose visual style leaned heavily into large-scale action sequences, dramatic lighting, and sweeping desert and cityscape shots meant to give the film a blockbuster feel worthy of its enormous budget, which is reported to have been somewhere between $125 million and nearly $200 million once marketing and additional costs are factored in. At the heart of the story is Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, an American soldier and self-interested treasure hunter operating in the deserts of Iraq. Nick is not a heroic figure in the traditional sense when the story begins. He is a soldier who uses his military position to smuggle and sell ancient artifacts on the black market, working alongside his partner and friend Chris Vail, played by Jake Johnson, who provides much of the film's comic relief throughout the story. During what begins as a routine operation gone wrong, an airstrike accidentally uncovers a massive hidden tomb buried deep beneath the Mesopotamian desert, a tomb that was never meant to be found because of the pure evil it was built to contain. This unexpected discovery draws the attention of Dr. Jennifer Halsey, portrayed by Annabelle Wallis, a British archaeologist working with a secretive organization that specializes in tracking and containing supernatural threats throughout history. Halsey has a personal history with Nick, and their reunion under these strange circumstances becomes an important emotional thread running through the film. As the excavation team investigates the ancient burial site, they gradually uncover the true nature of the tomb. Buried within is Ahmanet, a princess of ancient Egypt from thousands of years in the past, whose story is revealed to the audience through flashbacks. Ahmanet, played by Algerian-French actress and former dancer Sofia Boutella, was once destined to inherit the throne of Egypt from her father the pharaoh, but her claim to power was stripped away the moment her father had a son with another wife, a son who would take her rightful place as heir. Consumed by ambition and fury at being denied her destiny, Ahmanet made a dark and forbidden pact with the ancient Egyptian god of death and chaos known as Set. In exchange for the god's power, she agreed to become his vessel on earth, murdering her father, his newborn son, and her father's wife in order to clear her path to the throne. She then attempted to complete the ritual by sacrificing a lover to allow Set's spirit to fully take physical form, using an ancient ceremonial dagger created specifically for that dark purpose. Before she could finish the ritual, however, she was captured by the palace priests, who considered her crime so monstrous that ordinary execution was not considered a fitting punishment. Instead, she was mummified alive, her body drained of its natural fluids, and sealed for eternity deep within a hidden tomb far from Egypt itself, buried in a location believed strong enough to contain her curse forever, alongside the dagger and the ruby meant to complete the transformation of Set into a physical being. The location of her burial was deliberately built far from the Nile so that her body could never be resurrected through the traditional Egyptian rites tied to the river, and legions of soldiers and priests reportedly gave their lives across the following centuries simply guarding the secret of where she was hidden. When Nick Morton and the excavation team break into the ancient burial chamber, they inadvertently begin the process of freeing Ahmanet from her thousands of years of imprisonment. Complications quickly escalate when the tomb and its cursed contents are placed onto a military transport plane bound for London, along with Nick, Halsey, and Vale. During the flight, Vale, who has already come into direct contact with Ahmanet's lingering curse, becomes possessed and attacks the crew, resulting in a violent and now iconic plane crash sequence in which the aircraft breaks apart mid-air and Nick appears to die in the wreckage. However, Nick soon awakens completely unharmed, confused as to how he survived an accident that should have killed him instantly. This mysterious survival becomes a central mystery of the film, as it becomes evident that Ahmanet has chosen Nick specifically to be her chosen consort, the human vessel meant to become the physical host for the god Set once the ritual dagger and ruby are reunited. Throughout the rest of the film, Ahmanet, now fully awakened and steadily growing in supernatural power by draining life force from those she encounters, pursues Nick relentlessly through the streets and hidden corners of London, using her expanding abilities to summon the dead, manipulate sand, and exert mind control over others in order to draw him toward her and complete the ancient ritual that was interrupted thousands of years earlier. Alongside this pursuit, Nick and Halsey become entangled with a secretive organization known as Prodigium, led by the enigmatic Dr. Henry Jekyll, played by Russell Crowe. Prodigium exists specifically to study, contain, and if necessary destroy supernatural threats and monstrous entities that the ordinary world is not prepared to face, and Jekyll reveals that he himself struggles daily to suppress a violent alternate persona, the character widely known from classic literature as Mr. Hyde, showing early on that the dark universe intended to weave many classic monster characters into this shared narrative framework. Jekyll initially intends to use Ahmanet's immense power for controlled scientific and strategic purposes once she is captured, but his own inner struggle with his darker half complicates matters considerably as the story unfolds. As Ahmanet grows stronger and her control over the undead expands, Nick begins to experience strange visions and even develops a supernatural connection to her, seemingly gaining glimpses of ancient Egyptian iconography and even brief flashes of power himself, hinting that his fate is becoming intertwined with the ancient curse in ways he does not yet fully understand. The film builds toward its climax as Ahmanet finally succeeds in retrieving the ceremonial dagger and captures Nick, preparing to complete the ritual that was denied to her all those centuries ago. In an intense and visually elaborate final confrontation staged within the ruins of a collapsed and crumbling church converted into an underground tomb beneath London, Ahmanet attempts to plunge the dagger into Nick's chest to finally grant Set a physical vessel through him. In a pivotal turning point, Nick makes the choice to willingly accept the darkness rather than resist it, absorbing Ahmanet's power directly into himself instead of allowing her ritual to succeed in its intended form. This decision effectively destroys Ahmanet, ending her physical existence, while transforming Nick himself into a being caught between humanity and the supernatural forces he has now inherited. In the aftermath, Nick is shown embracing a new identity, having gained immortality along with formidable powers drawn from the ancient curse, but also burdened with an internal darkness he must learn to control, echoing the same struggle that Dr. Jekyll described earlier in the film. The ending strongly hints that Nick's transformation was intended to set up future storylines within the planned Dark Universe, positioning him as a new kind of hero who exists on the boundary between monster and man, someone capable of standing against the other creatures Universal intended to introduce in subsequent films. In terms of the cast beyond the central trio, Courtney B. Vance appears as Colonel Greenway, a senior military officer connected to Nick's unit, whose role ties the human military side of the story to the supernatural events unfolding around them. Marwan Kenzari plays Fahid, a local guide and driver assisting Nick and Vale in their operations in Iraq at the start of the film, providing another human perspective caught in the wake of the awakening threat. The film also includes appearances from performers such as Javier Botet, an actor well known in the horror genre for his distinctive physicality in portraying unsettling and inhuman characters, who contributes to some of the film's more grotesque undead imagery. Tom Cruise, as the lead, brought his trademark commitment to performing many of his own stunts, a hallmark of his acting career, and reports from the production revealed that he had significant creative influence over the film's shape, reportedly shaping aspects of the script, the editing, and even elements of how scenes were directed, which became a notable talking point once the film was released. Since some observers felt his outsized involvement affected the balance of the story and shifted focus away from Sofia Boutella's Ahmanet, a character many considered one of the film's genuine highlights. The Mummy had its world premiere on May 22, 2017, at the State Theatre in Sydney, Australia, before going on to a wide theatrical release across the United States on June 9, 2017, distributed globally by Universal Pictures. The film's international rollout was accompanied by an extensive marketing campaign designed to introduce audiences not just to a single movie but to the beginning of an entire new cinematic universe. Several trailers were released in the months leading up to launch, each one gradually revealing more of Ahmanet's terrifying resurrection, the scale of the London-based action sequences, and the introduction of Dr. Jekyll and the Prodigium organization, all while emphasizing Tom Cruise's presence as the anchor of this new franchise given his enormous box office draw. The trailers lean heavily into large-scale visual spectacle, including the now famous zero-gravity plane crash sequence, in an effort to position the film as a blockbuster event on the scale of the studio's biggest action franchises, rather than a smaller-scale horror film in the vein of the character's earliest cinematic origins. Despite this ambitious build-up and a worldwide box office total exceeding $400 million, which on paper appears to be a financial success given the ticket sales alone, the film was ultimately considered a significant disappointment once production and marketing costs were factored in, and more importantly it was met with overwhelmingly negative reviews from film critics upon release. Critics frequently pointed to an inconsistent tone that struggled to balance horror, comedy, and blockbuster action, along with a narrative that felt overloaded with the responsibility of introducing an entire shared universe rather than being allowed to simply tell its own contained story. Many reviewers also noted that Tom Cruise's larger-than-life star persona sat awkwardly against the atmosphere a mummy story traditionally calls for, while others praised Sofia Boutella's performance as a genuine bright spot that deserved a stronger film built around her. The overwhelmingly negative critical reception, combined with the film's failure to ignite the kind of sustained audience enthusiasm needed to justify multiple new spin-off films, effectively brought an end to Universal's Dark Universe plans almost as quickly as they had been announced, with the studio quietly shifting its classic monster properties towards smaller, more independent standalone projects in the years that followed rather than continuing with the interconnected universe model the Mummy was meant to launch. Looking back at The Mummy from a wider perspective, The film stands as a fascinating case study in Hollywood's attempts to replicate the success of shared cinematic universes during the 2010s, a period when many studios were eager to follow in the footsteps of Marvel's dominant model. Universal possessed one of the richest libraries of classic horror characters in cinema history, characters that had already proven their cultural staying power across nearly a century of adaptations, reinterpretations, and reinventions. The ambition behind reviving these characters together in one connected world was understandable given how valuable that shared brand recognition could have been if executed successfully. However, The Mummy illustrates the risks of prioritizing franchise building over the strength of an individual story. So much of the film's runtime is spent laying groundwork for future installments, introducing Prodigium, hinting at other monsters, and establishing Dr. Jekyll's role as a connective figure across the planned universe, that the core story of Ahmanet's tragic transformation from a wronged princess into a vengeful, God-possessed entity often gets pushed to the background in favor of setting up sequels that would ultimately never materialize in the way Universal originally envisioned. Sofia Boutella's portrayal of Ahmanet remains one of the more compelling elements of the film, specifically because her character carries genuine emotional weight, a story rooted in betrayal, stolen destiny, and a desperate bargain with dark forces, themes that echo the tragic dimension found in the very best classic monster stories throughout cinema history. Had the film trusted that story more fully and resisted the urge to overload itself with universe-building elements, many critics and fans alike have suggested it might have found a much stronger identity of its own. Instead, The Mummy became remembered less for its own merits and more as a cautionary example of what can happen when a single film is asked to carry the weight of launching an entire franchise before it has even had the chance to prove itself as a standalone success. Even so, the film's technical achievements, from its elaborate desert and London set pieces to its ambitious visual effects work depicting Ahmanet's growing supernatural powers, demonstrate the genuine talent and resources that went into its production, even if the final result did not come together in the way its creators had hoped. The Mummy 2017: The Complete Story. The story of The Mummy begins thousands of years before its present-day setting, deep within the height of ancient Egyptian civilization, during the reign of a powerful pharaoh who ruled with the guidance of his most trusted priests and advisors. His firstborn child was a daughter named Ahmanet, a young woman of extraordinary intelligence, ambition, and beauty, raised from birth to believe that the throne of Egypt would one day belong to her. In a society that rarely granted women the right to rule outright, Ahmanet was groomed as an exception, trained in matters of governance, ritual, and power, because her father had no other heir. For years she lived with the certainty that she alone would inherit the crown, the palace, and the divine authority that came with ruling over one of the greatest civilizations the ancient world had ever known. That certainty shattered the moment her father took a new wife, a much younger woman who soon became pregnant. When the child was born and revealed to be a son, the entire court celebrated the arrival of a new male heir, and in an instant Ahmanet's lifelong destiny was stripped away from her without ceremony or apology. She was expected to simply accept this reversal, to step aside gracefully and allow her infant half-brother to one day claim the throne that she had spent her entire life preparing to inherit. Ahmanet, however, was not a woman built for quiet acceptance. Beneath her composed and regal exterior burned a fury that grew heavier with every day she was forced to watch her father dote upon his new wife and their infant son, knowing that everything she had once been promised now belonged to a child who had done nothing to earn it beyond simply being born male. Rather than resign herself to this fate, Ahmanet turned to the darkest corners of Egyptian religious tradition, seeking out forbidden knowledge that most in her position would never dare approach. She began secretly communing with Set, the ancient Egyptian god associated with chaos, storms, and destruction, a deity feared and often shunned in official religious practice because of his connection to disorder and death. Where others saw only danger in invoking such a god, Ahmanet saw opportunity. Set offered her a bargain unlike anything she could have received through legitimate means. He promised her not just the throne she had been denied, but power far beyond what any mortal pharaoh had ever wielded, on the condition that she would serve as his vessel, allowing his spirit to cross over from the realm of the gods into the physical world through her body. To complete this transformation, Ahmanet would need to perform an elaborate and horrifying ritual, one that required a sacred dagger known as the Dagger of Set, along with a large ruby that would serve as the final missing piece needed to fully anchor the god's spirit into a physical form. Ahmanet accepted the bargain without hesitation, driven by a mixture of grief, humiliation, and consuming ambition that no longer left room for doubt or mercy. Under the cover of night, within the hidden chambers of the palace, Ahmanet set her plan into motion. She murdered her father the pharaoh first, ending the life of the man who had once promised her everything before taking it away. She then turned her wrath upon his new wife and the infant son who had unknowingly replaced her as heir, extinguishing both of their lives in acts of chilling, calculated violence. With her rivals eliminated, Ahmanet believed the path was finally clear for her to complete the ritual and claim her transformation into the vessel of Set, securing power that no one would ever again be able to take from her. The final stage of the ritual required a human sacrifice, a life given willingly or unwillingly to open the passage between the mortal world and the realm of the gods she had pledged herself to. Ahmanet chose her own lover for this purpose, a man who had shared her bed and her confidence, believing that his death would be the final key needed to complete her transformation. She led him into the ritual chamber, the dagger of Set in hand, prepared to plunge the blade into his chest and finish what she had started. Before she could complete the sacrifice, the palace guards and priests, who had already discovered the bodies of the murdered pharaoh, his wife, and their infant son, burst into the chamber and stopped her before the ritual could be finished. Ahmanet was seized, her lover spared at the final moment, and the full extent of her crimes laid bare before the entire kingdom. What she had done was considered so monstrous, so far beyond the bounds of ordinary punishment, that the priests determined death alone would not be sufficient justice. Execution would have been too merciful, too quick an end for a woman who had murdered her own father, an innocent stepmother, and a newborn child purely out of jealousy and thirst for power. Instead, the priests decided upon a punishment that would ensure Ahmanet suffered for all eternity. She was to be mummified alive, her body prepared through the same sacred processes normally reserved for honoring the dead, except she would remain conscious and aware throughout the entire ordeal. Her organs were removed in the traditional manner of Egyptian mummification, her body treated with the oils, resins, and wrappings meant to preserve the physical form indefinitely, all while she remained alive within the process, cursed to exist in a state between life and death for as long as her prison could contain her. Understanding the magnitude of the threat they had uncovered, the priests refused to bury Ahmanet using the traditional funerary customs reserved for royalty. Egyptian tradition held that proper burial along the Nile River, accompanied by the correct rites, allowed the dead to be reborn or to pass safely into the afterlife. The priests deliberately denied Ahmanet this path, fearing that if she were ever granted proper burial rites near the Nile, some future ritual or unforeseen circumstance might allow her curse to be reawakened and completed. Instead, her body, along with the dagger of Set and the ruby meant to complete the ritual, was transported an immense distance away from Egypt entirely, carried across deserts and mountains to a remote, hidden location far removed from anything resembling her homeland. There, in complete secrecy, they constructed an elaborate underground tomb designed specifically to contain her for all time, filled with defensive mechanisms and sealed behind layers of stone and earth meant to ensure that no one would ever stumble upon her prison by accident. The location of this tomb became one of the most closely guarded secrets in the ancient world. Generations of soldiers and priests were assigned the sacred duty of protecting the secret, many of them giving their lives in service of ensuring Ahmanet's curse would never again see the light of day. Over the centuries, the exact knowledge of where she had been buried faded from memory, becoming little more than legend, until eventually the location was lost entirely to history, buried not only beneath the earth but beneath thousands of years of time itself. The story then shifts forward across the vast span of centuries into the present day, landing in the war-torn deserts of Iraq, where American soldier Nick Morton serves as part of a reconnaissance unit. Nick is not the kind of soldier driven purely by duty or patriotism. He is resourceful, quick-witted, and morally flexible, using his military position and knowledge of the region to identify and steal ancient artifacts whenever the opportunity presents itself, which he then sells on the black market for personal profit. His closest companion and partner in these schemes is Chris Vale, a fellow soldier who shares Nick's willingness to bend the rules for financial gain, and the two of them share an easy camaraderie built on trust, shared risk, and years of operating just outside the boundaries of what their official duties actually permit. Alongside them is a local guide named Fahid, whose knowledge of the region and its people helps Nick and Vale navigate both the physical dangers of the desert and the complicated relationships between local communities and the ongoing military presence surrounding them. During what begins as a routine reconnaissance mission near a small village, Nick and Vale find themselves caught in an unexpected firefight, one that quickly spirals beyond their control as insurgents pin them down under heavy fire. In an act of desperation meant to save their lives, Nick calls in an airstrike on the exact coordinates of their own position, gambling that the American forces overhead will be precise enough to eliminate the immediate threat without harming him and his companions. The gamble pays off, the enemy combatants are eliminated, and Nick and Vale survive the encounter largely unharmed. However, the airstrike does something far more significant than simply neutralizing the immediate danger. The force of the explosion tears open the earth beneath the village, revealing a massive sinkhole that exposes an enormous hidden structure buried far below the surface, a structure clearly ancient, clearly man-made, and clearly not meant to ever be found. Nick, ever alert to the potential value of undiscovered artifacts, immediately recognizes the significance of what the explosion has uncovered and understands that this could be the most valuable find of his entire career as an opportunistic scavenger of history's forgotten treasures. News of the discovery quickly reaches Dr. Jennifer Halsey, a British archaeologist working in the region on behalf of a mysterious organization that operates behind the scenes, tracking historical anomalies and artifacts connected to supernatural phenomena that most of the world remains entirely unaware of. Halsey has a complicated personal history with Nick, having previously spent time with him during an earlier encounter that ended with him stealing a valuable artifact directly from beneath her while she slept, souring her opinion of him considerably even as an undeniable spark of attraction lingers beneath her frustration. When she arrives at the site of the newly uncovered structure alongside a team of military personnel and researchers, she quickly identifies telltale signs suggesting this is no ordinary Egyptian ruin. The symbols carved into the stone, the layout of the chamber, and the sheer scale of the effort clearly invested in constructing and concealing this location all point towards something significant enough to require this level of secrecy and protection thousands of years ago. As the excavation team carefully makes their way deeper into the newly exposed structure, they discover an enormous underground chamber filled with ancient Egyptian religious iconography, entirely out of place given its location far from Egypt itself. At the center of the chamber lies a massive sarcophagus, submerged within a pool of mercury, an element the ancient Egyptians associated with purification and containment of powerful and dangerous forces. The presence of mercury alone signals to Halsey and her team that whatever lies within this sarcophagus was considered dangerous enough to warrant this level of extraordinary precaution. As the team continues investigating the tomb, Nick becomes separated from the others and stumbles upon Chris Vale, who has become entranced by strange markings within a smaller side chamber connected to the main burial site. Unbeknownst to either of them, this side chamber has begun releasing lingering traces of Ahmanet's ancient curse into the surrounding air, and Vale, spending prolonged time near the source, begins to fall increasingly under its influence without immediately realizing what is happening to him. Meanwhile, Nick discovers something else within the tomb entirely unrelated to Ahmanet's sarcophagus, an item that will later prove significant, though its full importance remains hidden for now. As the excavation continues and military authorities begin making preparations to transport the extraordinary discovery back to England for further study, tensions rise between Nick, who wants to ensure he profits from whatever is found, and Halsey, who insists that the discovery be treated with the scientific and historical seriousness it demands rather than as another opportunity for personal enrichment. The decision is made to transport Ahmanet's sarcophagus, along with the recovered artifacts, aboard a military cargo plane bound for London, where Halsey's organization intends to study the find in a secure and controlled environment. Nick, Halsey, and Vale all board the aircraft alongside a small military escort, unaware of just how quickly the situation is about to spiral out of control. During the flight, Vale's condition worsens dramatically. The curse that has taken hold of him since his exposure in the tomb begins manifesting in horrifying physical ways, his eyes clouding over, his behavior becoming erratic and violent, and eventually his body succumbing entirely to the influence that Ahmanet's presence has exerted over him even from within her sealed sarcophagus. Vale attacks the crew of the aircraft in a sudden and terrifying outburst, and in the ensuing chaos, the plane sustains catastrophic damage, beginning to break apart in mid-air. Nick and Halsey find themselves fighting simply to survive as the aircraft disintegrates around them, the cargo hold tearing open, and the sarcophagus itself becoming dislodged and eventually falling from the wreckage as the plane spirals violently toward the earth below. In the final moments before impact, believing there is no way to survive the crash, Nick makes the decision to give Halsey his parachute, sacrificing his own chance of survival in an act of protection that reveals a deeper sense of decency buried beneath his usual self-serving instincts. The aircraft crashes with devastating force, and in the aftermath, Nick's body is found seemingly lifeless among the wreckage scattered across the English countryside. Against every expectation, Nick wakes up shortly afterward inside a body bag at the local mortuary, completely unharmed despite having been declared dead at the crash site. This impossible survival immediately marks him as something unusual, though either Nick nor anyone around him yet understands the true reason behind it. Confused and disoriented, Nick makes his way back to Halsey, desperate for answers about what exactly happened during the crash and how he possibly survived an accident that should have killed him instantly. Halsey, equally shaken by the impossible nature of his survival, begins to suspect that Nick's unexplained resurrection is somehow connected to Ahmanet, whose sarcophagus fell from the plane during the crash and has now gone missing somewhere in the surrounding countryside. As the two of them attempt to piece together what is happening, they soon discover that Ahmanet's sarcophagus has been recovered by unknown parties and quietly transported to a secretive underground facility in London, one belonging to an organization known as Prodigium. It is at this point in the story that Dr. Henry Jekyll enters the narrative, revealed as the enigmatic leader of Prodigium, an organization dedicated entirely to studying, containing, and when necessary eliminating supernatural threats that the wider world remains blissfully unaware of. Jekyll operates from a vast underground facility hidden beneath the streets of London, filled with specimens, artifacts, and contained entities collected from centuries of encounters with the monstrous and the inexplicable. He explains to Nick and Halsey that Prodigium exists precisely because of ancient evils like Ahmanet, forces from the deep past that occasionally resurface into the modern world and must be handled with extreme caution, scientific rigor, and when necessary, lethal force. Jekyll reveals that he has been tracking rumors and legends of a powerful ancient Egyptian entity for years, and the discovery of Ahmanet's tomb represents an opportunity he has long anticipated, an opportunity to finally study and potentially harness her power for what he believes are responsible and controlled purposes. What Nick and Halsey do not immediately realize is that Jekyll himself harbors a dangerous secret, struggling daily against an alternate and far more violent persona lurking within him, a duality he must constantly work to suppress through an ongoing regimen of injections and careful self-discipline. This inner struggle mirrors, in many ways, the very battle between light and darkness that Nick himself will soon come to understand on a much more personal level. Meanwhile, Ahmanet, though still physically imprisoned within her ancient wrappings and no longer confined to her original sarcophagus, begins to awaken more fully now that she has been freed from the deep isolation of her original tomb. Drawing strength from the confusion and disruption surrounding her transport to London, she slowly begins to break free of her physical restraints while being examined within Prodigium's secure facility. As her strength grows, so does her supernatural influence over the world around her, and she orchestrates a dramatic escape from the facility, overwhelming the guards and researchers stationed there through a combination of physical strength and eerie mind control abilities that allow her to bend the will of those she encounters. During her escape, she comes face to face with Nick for the first time since their fateful encounter in the ancient tomb, and it becomes immediately clear that she recognizes something significant in him, referring to him as her chosen one, the man destined to become the vessel through which she will finally complete her ancient bargain with Set. Nick, still struggling to understand what is happening to him, narrowly escapes the encounter alongside Halsey, but the pursuit has only just begun. As Ahmanet moves through London, her powers continue expanding at an alarming rate. She begins raising the dead in eerie and horrifying displays, commanding reanimated corpses as extensions of her will, using them to hunt down Nick and eliminate anyone who might stand between her and the completion of her ritual. She manipulates sand and dust with supernatural ease, uses her growing mind control abilities to influence the actions of ordinary people around her, and steadily drains life force from those she encounters in order to restore and strengthen her own withered, ancient body, gradually transforming from the desiccated, wrapped figure first uncovered in the tomb into something closer to her original human form, albeit corrupted by millennia of dark power. Throughout this escalating pursuit, Nick begins experiencing strange and unsettling symptoms of his own. He starts seeing visions connected to ancient Egyptian imagery, experiences moments where he seems to gain flashes of supernatural strength or awareness beyond his own understanding, and gradually comes to realize that his survival of the plane crash was never an accident or coincidence, but rather a direct consequence of the connection Ahmanet has forged with him. A connection tying his very life and fate to her ancient curse whether he wants it or not. Desperate for answers, Nick and Halsey continue working alongside Jekyll and the resources of Prodigium, uncovering more about the nature of Ahmanet's curse, the significance of the Dagger of Set, and the ruby needed to complete her transformation into the physical vessel of the god she pledged herself to millennia earlier. They learn that Ahmanet requires both items, along with a willing or unwilling human sacrifice, in order to finally succeed in bringing Set fully into the physical world, and that Nick himself has been chosen specifically to serve as that sacrifice, his body meant to become the vessel through which the ancient god will finally manifest after thousands of years of failed attempts. This revelation forces Nick to confront the terrifying reality of his situation directly, understanding that unless Ahmanet can be stopped, he is destined to become nothing more than a conduit for the very evil that has been pursuing him relentlessly since the moment the tomb was first uncovered back in Iraq. As the story moves toward its climax, Ahmanet successfully reclaims the Dagger of Set, having tracked down its location through her expanding supernatural awareness and her connection to Nick. With the dagger finally back in her possession, she needs only to capture Nick and complete the final stage of the ritual in order to achieve what she was denied thousands of years earlier. In a dramatic sequence set within the crumbling ruins of an ancient underground crypt hidden beneath a historic London church, one that has stood largely forgotten for centuries despite the modern city built up around it, Ahmanet finally succeeds in capturing Nick, binding him within the ritual chamber, and preparing to complete the ceremony that will transfer Set's spirit into his body forever. Halsey, alongside remaining allies from Prodigium, races against time to reach the location and stop the ritual before it can be completed, while Jekyll's own internal struggle against his darker persona reaches a breaking point precisely when his steady presence and control are needed most, complicating the efforts to intervene at the crucial moment. Within the ritual chamber, As Ahmanet raises the dagger set above Nick, prepared to finally deliver on the pact she made with the ancient gods so long ago, Nick is faced with an impossible choice. He can continue resisting, hoping against hope that some external intervention will save him at the last possible moment, or he can make a far more drastic decision, one that requires him to embrace the darkness Ahmanet represents rather than simply resist it from the outside. In the story's pivotal turning point, Nick chooses the latter path, willingly opening himself to the ancient power flowing through Ahmanet rather than allowing her to force it upon him through the ritual as originally intended. This act of willing acceptance fundamentally alters the nature of the exchange taking place between them. Rather than becoming a passive vessel controlled entirely by Set's ancient will, Nick absorbs the immense power flowing from Ahmanet directly into himself on his own terms, effectively hijacking the very rituals she believed would finally grant her the triumph she had waited thousands of years to achieve. The consequences of this unexpected reversal proved catastrophic for Ahmanet. Deprived of the vessel she required and unable to maintain her own physical form without completing the ritual as intended, her body begins to disintegrate, the centuries of accumulated power and preserved existence finally collapsing all at once, reducing her once again to dust and ancient remains. Her long pursuit of vengeance and immortality ending in the very chamber where she had come so close to finally achieving it. In the aftermath of Ahmanet's destruction, Nick emerges from the encounter forever changed, having absorbed a portion of the ancient power that once belonged to her, along with a connection to the darker forces she represented throughout the story. He finds himself now possessing extraordinary abilities far beyond ordinary human limits, along with a form of immortality that separates him permanently from the life he once knew as a simple, if morally flexible, American soldier. However, this newfound power comes bundled with a corresponding burden, an internal darkness that echoes the same struggle Dr. Jekyll described earlier in the story regarding his own battle against his violent alternate persona. Nick must now learn to control and manage this duality within himself, understanding that the line between hero and monster is far thinner than he ever imagined before his fateful discovery in the deserts of Iraq. Halsey, having witnessed everything that transpired and having grown considerably closer to Nick throughout their shared ordeal, remains by his side as he begins adjusting to this strange new existence, offering him support as he navigates the uncertain path that now lies ahead of him. The story closes with strong suggestions that Nick's transformation represents the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one that positions him as a unique figure existing on the boundary between the human world and the hidden realm of monsters that Prodigium exists to monitor and contain, hinting at a future where he might be called upon to confront other ancient threats yet to reveal themselves. Standing as a new kind of protector shaped directly from the very darkness he was nearly consumed by. Throughout this entire journey, the story of the mummy weaves together several interconnected threads. The tragic downfall of a woman denied her rightful destiny and consumed by the darkness that followed, the unexpected transformation of a self-interested opportunist into something far greater and far more burdened than he ever anticipated becoming, and the introduction of a hidden world of ancient evils and secretive protectors existing just beneath the surface of everyday modern life. Ahmanet's tragedy remains central to understanding the emotional core of the film. A princess whose legitimate claim to power was stripped away through no fault of her own, whose grief and humiliation curdled into a thirst for vengeance so consuming that it ultimately cost her everything, trapping her in a cycle of suffering that stretched across thousands of years before finally reaching its conclusion in the ruins of a London crypt. Nick's arc mirrors this tragedy in an inverted form, a man who begins the story caring for nothing beyond his own immediate profit and survival, forced through circumstances entirely beyond his control to confront questions of sacrifice, identity, and the true nature of the power he ultimately chooses to embrace rather than resist. The introduction of Prodigium and Dr. Jekyll, meanwhile, opens the door to a much larger world hinted at throughout the story, one populated by other legendary monsters and hidden threats that the organization has spent generations working to contain, setting the stage for a shared universe of stories that the film's ending clearly intends to continue exploring in the chapters that were meant to follow. The Mummy 2017 Cast Life Histories. The story of The Mummy is brought to life by a cast of performers whose own personal journeys to Hollywood are often just as compelling as the ancient legend they helped bring to the screen. Behind every character in this film stands an actor who traveled a long and often unpredictable road before ever stepping onto a film set in London or Oxfordshire, and understanding those journeys adds an entirely new layer of appreciation for what audiences see on screen. At the center of the film is Tom Cruise, who plays the morally flexible soldier Nick Morton. Cruise was born Thomas Cruise Maypother IV on July 3, 1962, in Syracuse, New York, the third child and only son of Thomas Cruise Maypother III, an electrical engineer, and Mary Lee Pfeiffer, who later worked as a special education teacher. His childhood was anything but stable in the traditional sense. Because of his father's career, the family moved constantly, living at various points in Ottawa, Canada, as well as Louisville, Kentucky, and several towns in New Jersey, before eventually settling in Glen Ridge, New Jersey. Across just 14 years of schooling, Cruise attended more than a dozen different schools, an upheaval that made it extremely difficult for him to build any lasting sense of stability during his formative years. Compounding these difficulties was the fact that Cruise struggled significantly with reading, a struggle that was eventually identified as dyslexia, a learning disorder that made traditional academic environments especially challenging for him throughout his youth. His parents divorced while he was still young, and his mother later remarried a man named Joseph South, adding yet another transition to an already unsettled childhood. Beyond the academic and domestic instability, some accounts of his upbringing describe a difficult home environment during his early years, with financial hardship shaping much of his day-to-day life. As a teenager, Cruise found an outlet in athletics, throwing himself into sports at Glen Ridge High School, and for a time he even considered the possibility of a future built around wrestling. That path was cut short when he suffered a serious knee injury that ended any realistic hope of pursuing sports competitively, a setback that forced him to reconsider what direction his life might take. Interestingly, before turning toward the stage, Cruise had also flirted with the idea of devoting his life to religious service, having spent a period of time at a seminary considering the priesthood before ultimately deciding that this was not the path he was meant to follow. It was only after these two doors closed, first athletics and then the possibility of religious life, that Cruise discovered acting almost by accident, joining his school's production of the musical Guys and Dolls. Landing the lead role of Nathan Detroit and thriving under the pressure of performance, Cruise realized that acting offered him something unique, a way to channel his competitive drive, hold an audience's attention, and importantly, work around his struggles with dyslexia, since memorizing dialogue exercised parts of his mind that reading text on a page did not. Following his high school graduation in 1980, Cruise made the bold decision to move to New York City to chase a professional acting career, and it was around this time that he shortened his birth name to the far more marketable Tom Cruise. Life in New York was not glamorous in the beginning. To support himself while auditioning for roles, Cruise worked a series of demanding, low-paying jobs, including work as a busboy, a porter, and a general table cleaner in restaurants around the city. His persistence paid off when he landed a small role in the 1981 film Endless Love at just 19 years old, marking his official entry into professional film acting. From there, Cruise's rise was rapid and dramatic. Small supporting roles gave way to his breakout performance in the 1983 hit Risky Business, a film that transformed him almost overnight into one of the most recognizable young actors in America. Just 3 years later, his starring role as naval aviator Lieutenant Pete Mitchell, known by the call sign Maverick, in the 1986 blockbuster Top Gun cemented his status as a genuine movie star, a title he has held for decades since. Throughout the remainder of the 1980s, Cruise built an increasingly impressive filmography, appearing in acclaimed projects including The Color of Money alongside Paul Newman, the comedy Cocktail, the widely celebrated drama Rain Man opposite Dustin Hoffman, and Born on the 4th of July, a war drama that earned him significant critical praise and an Academy Award nomination. By the 1990s, Cruise had firmly established himself among the highest-paid actors working in Hollywood, commanding enormous salaries for major studio productions and headlining films such as Interview with the Vampire, Jerry Maguire, which brought him another Academy Award nomination, and the original Mission Impossible, a franchise he would go on to lead as both star and producer for decades to come, eventually turning it into one of the most successful action franchises in cinema history. By the time production began on The Mummy in 2016, Cruise was not simply an actor for hire but also brought considerable influence over the shape of the production itself, reportedly involving himself deeply in decisions related to the script, the editing process, and broader creative direction, reflecting the immense creative control he had accumulated over a career spanning more than 3 decades in the industry. Opposite Cruise in the role of Ahmanet, the vengeful ancient Egyptian princess at the heart of the film's central curse, is Sofia Boutella, an Algerian-French performer whose path to acting ran through an entirely different world before she ever appeared in front of a film camera. Boutella was born on April 3, 1982, in the Bab el Oued district of Algiers, Algeria, into a household steeped in creativity and artistic expression. Her father, Saifi Boutella, is a respected jazz musician, composer, and arranger who studied at the prestigious Berklee College of Music, while her mother worked as an architect, meaning Sofia grew up surrounded by both musical and visual artistic influences from an extremely young age. She began classical dance training at just 5 years old, developing an early foundation in discipline, movement, and performance that would shape the rest of her career. In 1992, when Sofia was 10 years old, her family made the difficult decision to leave Algeria amid the turmoil of the Algerian Civil War, relocating to France in search of greater safety and opportunity. Once settled in France, Boutella shifted her athletic focus toward rhythmic gymnastics, eventually training with such dedication and skill that she earned a place on the French national gymnastics team by the age of 18. Her path soon diverged again, this time toward hip-hop and street dance, disciplines she embraced with the same intensity she had once applied to gymnastics. She became part of a dance collective known as Vagabond Crew, a group that achieved considerable recognition by winning the prestigious Battle of the Year competition in 2006, and she also participated in other performance groups including Chien de Vai and Aphrodite's. Her exceptional talent eventually caught the attention of renowned choreographer Blanca Lee, under whose guidance she continued refining her craft. A major turning point in her career arrived in 2007, when she was selected for a high-profile Nike advertising campaign choreographed by Jamie King, an opportunity that dramatically raised her profile within the dance and entertainment world. This exposure opened doors to collaborations with major recording artists, including an extended run as a backup dancer for Madonna, with whom she toured extensively across projects such as the Confessions Tour and the Sticky and Sweet Tour, performances that took her across the world and even included an appearance at the Super Bowl halftime show. During this period, Boutella's talent was reportedly noticed by pop icon Michael Jackson, who was said to be impressed enough by her dancing that he offered her a spot in his planned comeback concert series, an opportunity that ultimately never came to fruition due to scheduling conflicts and Jackson's untimely death in 2009. Rather than being discouraged, Boutella continued building her career, eventually appearing as the lead performer in the music video for Jackson's posthumously released song Hollywood Tonight in 2011. After more than a decade spent almost entirely within the world of professional dance, Boutella made the significant decision in 2014 to shift her focus toward acting, a transition that had already begun several years earlier when she took on the lead role in the dance-focused film Street Dance 2 in 2012. Her acting career quickly gained momentum, with prominent supporting roles in Kingsman, the Secret Service, and Star Trek Beyond, helping establish her as a rising talent capable of handling physically demanding action roles with the same precision she had once brought to dance performances. By 2017, the same year The Mummy was released, Boutella had also appeared in the acclaimed action film Atomic Blonde, marking a breakout year that firmly established her as a significant new presence in Hollywood action cinema, drawing directly on her decades of physical training to bring a uniquely commanding physicality to the role of Ahmanet. Playing Dr. Jennifer Halsey, the British archaeologist whose complicated history with Nick Morton drives much of the film's emotional core, is Annabelle Wallis, an English actress whose upbringing took place almost entirely outside of England despite her birthplace. Wallis was born on September 5, 1984, in Oxford, England, but her family relocated to Cascais, Portugal, when she was just 18 months old, meaning she spent the vast majority of her childhood and adolescence, roughly the first 17 years of her life, immersed in Portuguese culture rather than her country of birth. She attended St. Dominic's International School, an environment that brought together students from approximately 50 different nationalities, an experience that helped shape her into a genuinely multilingual performer fluent in English and Portuguese, with additional working knowledge of French and Spanish. Wallis comes from a family with notable connections to the entertainment industry, as her maternal great-uncle was the celebrated Irish actor Richard Harris, making her a relative of fellow actors Jared Harris and Jamie Harris, as well as director Damien Harris. On her father's side, she is connected to the historic English music hall singer Marie Lloyd, giving her a family history steeped in performance across multiple generations. Wallis began her professional journey with short films and advertisements while still based in Portugal, before making the decision at 19 years old to move to London with the specific goal of attending drama school and pursuing a more serious film career. Her earliest screen credit came somewhat unexpectedly in the form of an Indian film titled Dil Jo Bhi Kahe, released in 2005, marking an unconventional entry point into professional acting. She continued building her resume through a series of smaller television and film roles before landing what would become her first major breakthrough, being cast as Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, in the Showtime historical drama series The Tudors, a role she took over from actress Anita Breen during the show's third season in 2009. This high-profile costume drama role opened significant doors for Wallis, leading to additional television work including the ABC period series Pan Am, in which she portrayed a flight attendant secretly working as an MI6 agent, along with appearances in projects such as Strike Back, Project Dawn, and Fleming, The Man Who Would Be Bond. Her film career gained similar momentum during this period, and by 2013 she had joined the cast of the acclaimed BBC drama Peaky Blinders, portraying Grace Burgess, a role that would keep her connected to the series across multiple seasons and significantly raise her international profile. The following year, in 2014, Wallis took on a role that would introduce her to a completely different audience, appearing as Mia Form in the supernatural horror hit Annabelle, a film that performed strongly at the box office and helped establish her within the horror genre as well as mainstream drama. By the time she was cast in The Mummy in 2017, Wallis had already built a diverse and internationally recognized body of work spanning historical drama, horror, and prestige television, making her an established performer well-suited to anchor the human emotional center of a large-scale supernatural action film. Portraying Chris Vale, Nick Morton's close friend and partner in their black market artifact schemes whose fate takes a horrifying turn early in the story, is Jake Johnson, an American actor and comedian whose journey to Hollywood began far from the world of blockbuster filmmaking. Johnson was born Mark Jake Johnson Weinberger on May 28, 1978, in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb located just north of Chicago. His mother, Eve Johnson, worked as an artist specializing in stained glass windows, while his father, Ken Weinberger, owned a car dealership, and Johnson was named after his maternal uncle, Mark Johnson, who had tragically passed away at a young age. Johnson was largely raised by his mother, and the family moved periodically throughout the greater Chicago area during his childhood, with his mother at various points running small resale shops in addition to her artistic work with stained glass. Growing up in the Chicago area instilled in Johnson a deep affection for local institutions, including a lifelong devotion to the Chicago Cubs baseball team, as well as an early fascination with the city's legendary comedy scene, particularly the improvisational theater group Second City, which had launched the careers of comedy legends such as John Belushi, Tina Fey, and Chris Farley. Inspired by this rich tradition of Chicago comedy, Johnson pursued his craft through some of the most respected training grounds in American comedy, including stints with Second City itself and later the Upright Citizens Brigade after relocating to New York and eventually Los Angeles. His path toward professional acting involved considerable perseverance through the demanding worlds of stand-up comedy and improvisational theater before he began landing television and film roles. His earliest notable screen work included small guest appearances, such as playing an FBI agent in the science fiction drama series Flash Forward in 2009, alongside brief supporting roles in films like Paper Heart the same year and Get Him to the Greek in 2010. Johnson steadily built a reputation as a reliable scene stealer across a string of comedies throughout the early 2010s, appearing in projects such as Ceremony, No Strings Attached, and the stoner comedy of Very Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas, in which he took on the unusual role of portraying Jesus Christ. His career reached a significant turning point in 2011 when he was cast as Nick Miller in the Fox sitcom New Girl, playing opposite Zooey Deschanel in a role that would become his signature performance, and run for 7 seasons until the show's conclusion in 2018. The role earned him a nomination for the Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Actor in a Comedy Series and firmly established him as a recognizable comedic presence on American television. During and after his run on New Girl, Johnson continued expanding his film career, taking on notable roles in the ensemble comedy 21 Jump Street, the acclaimed independent film Drinking Buddies, in which he had his first true starring role, and the broad studio comedy Let's Be Cops in 2014 alongside his New Girl castmate Damon Wayans Jr. In 2015, Johnson joined the massive ensemble of the blockbuster Jurassic World, playing park employee Lowry Crothers alongside stars including Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard, an experience that gave him significant exposure within large-scale studio franchise filmmaking heading into his work on The Mummy in 2017. Where his comedic sensibility provided crucial tonal balance within the film's darker supernatural narrative. Filling the role of Colonel Greenway, the senior military officer connected to Nick's unit, is Courtney B. Vance, an accomplished American actor whose career reflects an unusually academic and theatrical foundation compared to many of his co-stars. Vance was born Courtney Bernard Vance on March 12, 1960, in Detroit, Michigan, the son of Conra Vance, who worked as a benefits administrator for the Chrysler Corporation, and Leslie Vance, a former librarian. Raised in a household that placed enormous value on discipline and academic achievement, Vance has described a childhood environment in which television was largely forbidden and bedtimes were strictly enforced, with his parents insisting that his focus remained squarely on education. He attended the prestigious Detroit Country Day School on scholarship, where he distinguished himself not only academically but athletically, serving as captain of the school's football, basketball, and track teams simultaneously. This combination of scholarly and athletic excellence earned him admission to Harvard University, where he enrolled in 1978 and majored in history. It was at Harvard, somewhat unexpectedly, that Vance discovered his passion for acting, having joined a theatrical group during his first year primarily as a way to make friends while feeling like a lonely freshman far from home. He quickly realized he had a genuine gift for performance, later describing the moment as one where he felt he had truly found his calling. While completing his undergraduate degree, Vance also gained valuable early experience performing with the Boston Shakespeare Company, further developing his classical theatrical training. After graduating from Harvard in 1982, Vance made the decision to pursue acting professionally, a choice that reportedly came as a considerable surprise to his parents given the academic path they had always envisioned for him. He continued his theatrical education at the Yale School of Drama, earning his Master of Fine Arts degree in 1986, and it was during his time at Yale that he met fellow acting student Angela Bassett, who would later become his wife. While at Yale, Vance originated the role of Corey in a production of August Wilson's Fences, sharing the stage with the legendary James Earl Jones, and he would go on to reprise this role in the show's celebrated 1987 Broadway debut, a performance that earned him both a Theatre World Award and a Tony Award nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Play. Vance continued building an impressive career across stage, television, and film throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, appearing in acclaimed projects such as The Hunt for Red October, Dangerous Minds, and Penny Marshall's The Preacher's Wife alongside Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston. His work in numerous television specials and historical dramas, including HBO's The Tuskegee Airmen and Hallmark Hall of Fame productions of August Wilson's The Piano Lesson, further cemented his reputation as a performer capable of bringing dignity and depth to historically and socially significant material. By the time he joined the cast of The Mummy in 2017, Vance had already accumulated decades of critical acclaim across multiple mediums, bringing considerable gravitas to his supporting role within the film's military and human storyline. Taking on the pivotal role of Dr. Henry Jekyll, the secretive leader of the monster-hunting organization Prodigium who struggles against his own darker alter ego, is Russell Crowe, an Academy Award-winning actor whose journey to international stardom began on the opposite side of the world from Hollywood. Crowe was born Russell Ira Crowe on April 7, 1964, in Wellington, New Zealand, to parents Jocelyn E. Vaughan and John Alexander Crowe, both of whom worked within the film and television industry as caterers on set productions. This early and constant exposure to film sets profoundly shaped his childhood, and his connection to the industry ran even deeper through his maternal grandfather, Stan Weems, a cinematographer who had earned recognition for his work filming footage during World War II. When Crowe was 4 years old, his family relocated to Sydney, Australia, where his parents continued their work catering film and television productions. This environment led directly to Crowe's earliest performance opportunities, and remarkably, he made his acting debut at just 6 years old, appearing in the Australian wartime spy adventure series Spy Force. Crowe spent roughly a decade of his childhood in Australia before his family returned to New Zealand, where as a teenager he pursued an entirely different creative outlet, co-founding a rock band originally called Roman Antics, which later evolved into the group 30-Odd Foot of Grunts, with Crowe serving as songwriter, guitarist, and lead vocalist. During this period, he also performed under the stage name Russell Rock, even releasing a single titled I Want to Be Like Marlon Brando in 1980, reflecting his early ambitions toward film stardom even while pursuing music. His attendance at various schools during these years included Vaucluse Public School and Sydney Boys High School in Australia, followed by Auckland Grammar School and Mount Roskill Grammar School after his family's return to New Zealand at age 14. Crowe's professional acting career began to take more serious shape in the mid to late 1980s, when he was cast in stage productions including The Rocky Horror Show and later Blood Brothers, along with the musical Bad Boy Johnny and the Prophets of Doom. During a particularly difficult stretch in 1987, Crowe turned to busking on the streets simply to make ends meet during a period without steady acting work, an experience that reflects the uncertainty he faced before achieving his eventual success. His breakthrough into film came through Australian cinema, beginning with his first leading role in The Crossing in 1990. A production notable for introducing him to actress Danielle Spencer, who would later become his wife. Crowe continued building his reputation throughout the Australian film industry, earning multiple Australian Film Institute awards for his performances in films such as Proof and Romper Stomper, before making the significant move to Hollywood in 1995 to star in The Quick and the Dead. His international breakthrough arrived with the acclaimed 1997 neo-noir film L.A. Confidential, followed shortly after by his Academy Award-nominated performance in The Insider in 1999. However, it was his portrayal of the Roman general-turned-gladiator Maximus in Ridley Scott's Gladiator in 2000 that transformed Crowe into a genuine global superstar, earning him the Academy Award for Best Actor and cementing his status as one of the defining leading men of his generation. Crowe went on to build an extraordinarily varied filmography over the following decades, including standout performances in A Beautiful Mind, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, Cinderella Man, and Les Miserables, in which his musical background allowed him to take on the singing role of Inspector Javert. By the time he joined The Mummy in 2017, Crowe brought decades of prestige and international recognition to the role of Dr. Jekyll, lending significant weight to the film's efforts to establish a much larger interconnected cinematic universe. Rounding out the principal cast is Marwan Kenzari, who plays Fahad, the local guide assisting Nick and Vale during the film's opening sequences in Iraq. Kenzari was born on January 16, 1983, in The Hague, Netherlands, to a Tunisian family, with his father working as a construction laborer and his mother caring for the household. As a teenager, Kenzari's primary passion was football rather than performance, and his introduction to acting came about almost entirely by chance, when a girlfriend at the time signed the two of them up together to audition for a Dutch-language production of the musical Chicago. This unexpected experience sparked an interest that would ultimately redirect the entire course of his life, leading him to pursue formal theatrical training at the Maastricht Academy of Dramatic Arts, from which he graduated in 2009. Following his graduation, Kenzari was recruited by the respected Toneelgroep Amsterdam Theatre Company, an opportunity that allowed him to tour internationally with the group, performing in major cities including London, Moscow, Vienna, and New York City. His screen career began in 2008 with the film Kadia's Sister, a drama exploring the experiences of immigrants within Dutch society, a subject matter that resonated with his own background as the child of immigrant parents. He continued building his career within Dutch television and film throughout the following years, including a recurring role as a con artist in the police drama series Flick and Maastricht and a lead performance in the 2011 drama Rabat, which followed a young Moroccan man on a journey of self-discovery. Kenzari's major breakthrough arrived in 2013 with his lead performance in the acclaimed Dutch crime drama Wolf, in which he portrayed a recently paroled kickboxer struggling to balance a legitimate athletic career against the pull of organized crime, a role that required over a year of dedicated physical training to portray convincingly. This performance earned him the prestigious Golden Calf Award for Best Actor at the Netherlands Film Festival, firmly establishing him as one of the most promising talents working in Dutch cinema. The following year, in 2014, Kenzari was selected as a shooting star by the Berlin International Film Festival, an honor recognizing rising European talent, while Variety magazine simultaneously highlighted him as an international talent to watch, further accelerating his transition toward English-language filmmaking. His crossover into Hollywood productions began in 2016, with roles in the historical epic Ben-Hur and the drama The Promise, quickly followed by an especially prolific year in 2017 that saw him appear not only in The Mummy but also in the thriller Collide and the star-studded adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. Fluent in Arabic, Dutch, English, and French, Kenzari has often spoken about the importance of his Tunisian heritage and Arab identity in shaping both his personal outlook and his approach to storytelling, values that would continue to inform his choice of roles in the years following his work on The Mummy, as his international career continued expanding into further major franchise films. Taken together, the journeys of these performers reveal just how varied the paths to a single Hollywood blockbuster can truly be, spanning continents, disciplines, and decades of preparation before ever converging on the sets of The Mummy in 2017. From a dyslexic teenager who once considered the priesthood before becoming one of the biggest movie stars in the world, to a former rhythmic gymnast and backup dancer who transformed herself into a commanding on-screen presence, to an Ivy League history major who found his calling on a Harvard stage, to a Chicago-born comedian who honed his craft through years of stand-up and improvisation, to a New Zealand-born son of film set caterers who became an Academy Award-winning leading man, to a Dutch-Tunisian actor whose acting career began with a chance audition arranged by a girlfriend. Each performer brought an entirely unique life story to the making of this single film, illustrating the remarkable diversity of backgrounds that so often converge behind the scenes of even a single Hollywood production. The Mummy 2017 budget, making of, and funny moments on set. When Universal Pictures set out to make The Mummy in 2017, the studio was not simply financing another action-adventure blockbuster. It was placing an enormous financial bet on the idea that its classic monster characters could be woven together into a single shared cinematic universe, one that studio executives hoped could eventually rival the box office dominance of Marvel's interconnected superhero franchise. That ambition came with an equally enormous price tag. The film's officially reported production budget sat at around $125 million. A figure that already placed it firmly among the more expensive studio productions released that year. However, once the full scope of talent salaries, elaborate practical stunt work, extensive visual effects, and a sprawling worldwide marketing campaign designed to launch not just a film but an entire franchise are factored into the equation, some industry estimates place the true total cost of bringing The Mummy to screens and promoting it globally at closer to $300 million or more when combined with distribution and marketing spend. This made The Mummy one of the single most expensive gambles Universal Pictures had placed on a reboot in its long history, a bet made even riskier by the fact that the film needed to succeed not only on its own merits, but also convince audiences that an entire slate of future monster films built around characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Invisible Man was worth investing in emotionally and financially over the following years. A significant portion of that budget went directly toward securing Tom Cruise as the film's leading man, with reports at the time indicating that his compensation package included a substantial upfront salary in addition to a share of the film's box office performance, reflecting his status as one of the most bankable and highest-paid actors working anywhere in the world at that point in his career. Beyond his salary, a considerable share of the budget was consumed by Cruise's insistence on performing many of his own stunts, a commitment that required specialized equipment, extensive safety planning, additional insurance considerations, and dedicated production time that a film relying more heavily on stunt doubles and green screen substitution would not have needed to budget for in the same way. The film's massive scale extended well beyond casting costs into its physical production requirements. Although the story moves between the deserts of Iraq and the streets of London, the vast majority of the film was actually shot across various locations in the United Kingdom, particularly around Oxfordshire and Greater London, supplemented by location shooting in Namibia to stand in for the harsh desert landscapes required for the film's opening sequences. Constructing convincing sets for both the ancient Egyptian tomb sequences and the modern London-based action set pieces required significant investment in production design, with entire sets built and later destroyed for the sake of a single dramatic sequence. A common but expensive practice in big-budget action filmmaking where realism and scale are considered essential to justifying a theatrical ticket price. The film's visual effects budget alone represented an enormous portion of the overall spend, given the sheer number of complex digital sequences required throughout the film, including Ahmanet's supernatural transformation from a withered, ancient mummy into her more human-looking resurrected form, the raising and animation of numerous undead creatures under her control, an extensive digital enhancement of the film's signature action sequences. Visual effects studios including MPC and Industrial Light and Magic were brought on to handle different portions of this work, with MPC responsible for many of the film's most technically demanding sequences, including nearly every shot involving Ahmanet's distinctive double-pupilled eyes, a subtle but labor-intensive digital detail added to every scene in which her face appeared on screen. Industrial Light and Magic's Vancouver team, meanwhile, focused heavily on bringing Ahmanet's physical transformation to life frame by frame, along with an elaborate dream sequence involving rats moving through a dark alleyway, one of the film's more unsettling and visually inventive moments. Perhaps the single most expensive and logistically extraordinary sequence in the entire production was the plane crash scene that occurs relatively early in the film, in which the military cargo aircraft carrying Nick, Halsey, Vale, and Ahmanet's sarcophagus disintegrates in mid-air after Vale becomes possessed and attacks the crew. Rather than relying entirely on conventional filmmaking techniques such as green screen work combined with a rotating gimbal rig, which is the standard and far more affordable approach typically used to simulate weightlessness and chaotic free fall inside an aircraft, Tom Cruise personally pushed the production toward a far more ambitious and expensive solution. Cruise insisted that at least part of the sequence be filmed using genuine weightlessness, achieved by shooting aboard a specially modified aircraft known informally as the Vomit Comet, a converted commercial jet operated by a company called Novspace that is normally used to train astronauts and conduct scientific research in short bursts of authentic zero-gravity conditions. The aircraft achieves this effect by climbing rapidly to an altitude of roughly 25,000 feet before dramatically reducing engine thrust and allowing the plane to enter a controlled freefall back toward the Earth, a maneuver that produces approximately 22 seconds of genuine weightlessness for everyone and everything inside the cabin before the plane must level out and repeat the climb all over again. Director Alex Kurtzman later explained that his original plan for the sequence had been far more conventional, involving a rotisserie-style set-piece combined with extensive green screen compositing, the standard toolkit most productions would use to simulate this kind of extreme scenario safely and affordably. Cruise, however, pushed hard for the more extreme and authentic approach, eventually convincing Kurtzman that the results would be worth the additional cost, complexity, and physical discomfort involved. Over the course of 2 full days of filming, the production crew completed a reported 45 separate parabolic climbs and freefalls aboard the aircraft, with Cruise and co-star Annabelle Wallis actually performing significant portions of their weightless acting inside the cabin during these brief windows of authentic zero-gravity, rather than having the effect added entirely through digital trickery afterward. The realities of filming aboard the Vomit Comet turned out to be every bit as physically demanding as its nickname suggests. Visual effects supervisor Eric Nash, who was present for every single flight during the 2-day shoot, later described the experience as genuinely unique and educational from a physics standpoint, noting that despite having previous skydiving experience himself, nothing quite compared to the sensation of true weightlessness repeated dozens of times in a single day. Nash also revealed that while he personally managed to avoid becoming physically ill during the shoot, roughly a third of the crew members present were not nearly so fortunate, succumbing to motion sickness brought on by the repeated and jarring transitions between crushing gravitational force during the climb and complete weightlessness during the subsequent freefall. To manage this very real and constant risk, every single crew member aboard the aircraft was issued a small bag that they were required to keep close at hand throughout the shoot, with instructions to try their best to catch anything that came up before it had the chance to float freely around the cabin in the zero-gravity environment. An image that is somehow both deeply unglamorous and strangely fitting for a big-budget Hollywood production chasing this level of practical realism. Kurtzman himself later joked about the sheer physical toll of the shoot, describing how the aircraft's violent shift from rocket-like acceleration during the climb to sudden weightlessness during the drop, followed immediately by a return to gravity at roughly double its normal force as the plane leveled out, took an enormous toll on everyone's body over the course of repeated attempts. Despite the discomfort involved, both Kurtzman and his visual effects team ultimately agreed that the decision paid off creatively, since the handful of shots captured using genuine weightlessness lent an unmistakable authenticity to the sequence that helped sell the illusion of the surrounding shots. many of which were filmed using more traditional techniques involving a specially built rotating cargo hold set combined with digital enhancement of the aircraft's exterior as it spiraled toward the ground in flames. Beyond the technical ambition of individual sequences like the plane crash, the day-to-day experience of working on the Mummy set produced a steady stream of amusing anecdotes and behind-the-scenes stories, many of which have surfaced publicly in the years since the film's release through interviews given by the cast. Chief among the sources of these stories has been Jake Johnson, whose comedic sensibility and relatively grounded career working primarily in television comedy made him something of an outside observer to the extreme world of big-budget action filmmaking that Tom Cruise had long since made his professional home. Johnson has spoken candidly and often quite humorously about his initial hesitation to even accept the role of Chris Vail in the first place. According to Johnson's own account, after signing on to the project largely because of the opportunity to work alongside Cruise, he eventually sat down to actually read the full script and quickly realized just how much of the role would require him to perform physically demanding stunts himself rather than relying on a stunt double. A realization that immediately filled him with dread given his television comedy background rather than any real history of action filmmaking. Johnson has described how alarmed he became at the prospect, reaching a point where he seriously considered backing out of the project entirely rather than following through with the physical demands the role required. Rather than simply phoning in his concerns or having his representatives handle the situation from a distance, Johnson found himself informed by the studio that if he truly intended to drop out, the appropriate and respectful course of action would be to fly to London and deliver the news to Tom Cruise directly and in person. A request that speaks volumes about the level of respect and formality that surrounded Cruise's position on the project. Johnson has recounted, with considerable self-deprecating humor, exactly how underprepared and unglamorous he felt arriving for this meeting, describing himself as showing up in cargo shorts and flip-flops, still wearing the disposable socks handed out on his long-haul flight, layered awkwardly under several sweatshirts he had thrown on for no clear reason, only to be brought directly into a lengthy sit-down conversation with one of the biggest movie stars in the world. What Johnson expected to be a tense and possibly career-ending conversation instead turned into a session lasting several hours, during which he found Cruise to be remarkably down-to-earth, funny, and easy to talk to, gradually winning him over not through pressure or intimidation but through genuine charm and humor. Johnson has recalled that Cruise spent much of the meeting playfully ribbing him about the very stunts that had caused his hesitation in the first place, at one point jokingly asking him with mock seriousness whether he felt comfortable sitting on a couch unassisted, or whether he might prefer having a trained stunt professional handle that task for him instead. A joke clearly meant to gently poke fun at Johnson's nervousness about the physical demands of the role. By the end of the extended conversation, Johnson found that he had gone from seriously considering walking away from the project entirely to becoming, in his own words, something close to a genuine fan of Cruise, ultimately deciding to commit fully to the role and follow through with the physically demanding stunt work the part required. That decision to stay on board led to Johnson experiencing firsthand just how intensely committed Cruise remains to physical performance and practical stunt work even well into his career, producing one of the most memorable and frequently retold anecdotes to emerge from the entire production. During one particularly demanding sequence, Johnson and Cruise were required to perform a stunt together that involved leaping across the gap between two buildings while explosions were triggered around them for dramatic effect, a sequence that included Johnson landing hard on a 3-story structure specifically built to collapse beneath the actors during the shot. Johnson has described landing awkwardly on his back during the stunt, and immediately feeling that something had gone wrong with the impact, prompting him to tell Cruise directly that he believed he had been hurt during the fall. According to Johnson's retelling of the exchange, rather than immediately calling for a halt to filming or checking on the nature of the injury in the way one might expect, Cruise instead calmly asked him a pointed and now famous follow-up question: wanting to know specifically whether Johnson considered himself merely injured or genuinely hurt in a way that would prevent him from continuing the shot. Johnson has recalled being genuinely confused by the distinction Cruise seemed to be drawing between these two states, responding honestly that he was not entirely sure what meaningful difference existed between being hurt and being injured in the context of a physical stunt that had just gone wrong. Cruise's follow-up clarification, according to Johnson, boiled the distinction down to a simple and pragmatic question, essentially asking whether Johnson felt capable of getting up and performing the stunt again immediately, or whether something more serious had happened that would require a pause in filming altogether. This exchange has since become something of a defining anecdote used to illustrate Cruise's famously singular focus and dedication when it comes to delivering practical action sequences for audiences, with Johnson himself acknowledging in later interviews that Cruise brings an intensity to physical filmmaking that few other actors working today would be willing or able to match. Driven by a genuine belief that audiences deserve to see real stunts performed by real actors whenever it is safely possible to do so. Beyond this particular story, Johnson has spoken more broadly in various interviews about the overall atmosphere Cruise brought to the set throughout production, describing him as an intense presence who approaches every single day of filming with the singular goal of ensuring audiences receive maximum entertainment value from whatever sequence is being shot that day. Johnson has been careful to clarify in these interviews that his comments are based purely on his observations of Cruise as a filmmaker and collaborator rather than any deeper personal friendship, but he has consistently described the experience in largely positive terms, framing Cruise's intensity as coming from a place of genuine dedication to craft rather than difficult or unpleasant behavior. According to Johnson, working alongside Cruise required a certain willingness to simply commit fully to whatever the day's stunt work demanded, since Cruise's entire approach to filmmaking centers around a willingness to put himself in physically demanding and occasionally dangerous situations purely in service of delivering an exciting final product for audiences in theaters. This attitude, Johnson noted, tends to set the tone for everyone else working alongside him, creating pressure for co-stars to match that same level of commitment even when their own backgrounds, like his own television comedy roots, had not necessarily prepared them for that kind of physically demanding filmmaking environment. Johnson was not the only cast member to share entertaining recollections from the production. In promotional interviews conducted around the time of the film's release, Sofia Boutella, Jake Johnson, and Annabelle Wallis appeared together to discuss some of their funniest shared memories from working alongside Cruise throughout the shoot, with the trio offering a rare glimpse into the more lighthearted moments that occurred amid the film's otherwise grueling and technically demanding production schedule. These conversations painted a picture of a set that, despite its enormous budget and the pressure surrounding its role as the intended launching point for an entire new franchise, still managed to maintain a sense of camaraderie and humor among its principal cast members even during the most physically exhausting and logistically complicated stretches of filming. Given the sheer number of elaborate stunts required throughout the production, ranging from building collapses and explosive set pieces to the previously mentioned zero-gravity plane sequence, it comes as little surprise that much of the cast's shared humor centered specifically around the shared experience of surviving those stunts together, trading stories about near misses, unexpected mishaps, and the strange bonding experience that comes from repeatedly putting your physical safety in the hands of an elaborate stunt team while trying to maintain a professional and often quite serious on-screen performance in the middle of it all. The film's ambitious production also extended into its unusual choice of practical filming locations, some of which came with their own set of logistical and occasionally amusing complications. Filming desert sequences meant to represent the Iraqi countryside required the production to travel to Namibia, a country whose vast and visually striking desert landscapes have made it a popular substitute location for films set in the Middle East and North Africa, despite the obvious geographic and cultural distance between southern Africa and the actual setting of the story. Coordinating a large-scale Hollywood production in such a remote filming environment inevitably introduced its own unique set of challenges entirely separate from anything the cast and crew would have encountered while filming closer to home in the more familiar surroundings of Oxfordshire and London. Meanwhile, back in England, production designers faced the considerable challenge of constructing sets capable of representing both the ancient underground tomb sequences that open the film and the various London locations that serve as the backdrop for much of the film's supernatural chaos, including the elaborately staged crypt sequence beneath a historic London church where the film's climactic confrontation between Nick and Ahmanet ultimately takes place. Building sets of this scale and complexity, particularly ones designed from the outset to eventually be destroyed or damaged on camera for dramatic effect, represents one of the more expensive and time-consuming aspects of any large-scale production, requiring extensive collaboration between production designers, special effects teams, and safety coordinators to ensure that elaborate practical destruction sequences could be filmed safely while still delivering the visceral, high-impact visuals that a modern blockbuster is expected to provide. Despite all of this enormous financial investment and technical ambition, or perhaps in some ways precisely because of it, The Mummy ultimately struggled to translate its production spending into a genuinely successful theatrical run once it reached audiences in the summer of 2017. The film went on to earn slightly more than $410 million at the worldwide box office, a figure that on its surface might appear to represent a reasonably successful outcome for any film, but which fell dramatically short of expectations once the full scope of the production and marketing budget was taken into account. Given that studios typically retain only a portion of total worldwide ticket sales after accounting for the significant cut taken by individual theater chains and exhibitors around the world, financial analysts estimated at the time that Universal likely needed the film to gross somewhere in the range of $400 to $450 million worldwide simply to break even on its investment. Meaning that even with its respectable box office total, the film almost certainly resulted in a net financial loss for the studio once every expense was properly accounted for. Some industry estimates published shortly after the film's disappointing opening weekend suggested that Universal could ultimately lose somewhere in the range of $75 to $95 million once all costs were finally tallied, a staggering shortfall for a film that had been specifically designed and marketed as the foundational cornerstone of an entire planned franchise spanning multiple future films. This financial disappointment was compounded significantly by the film's overwhelmingly negative reception among professional film critics, who gave the film exceedingly poor reviews upon release, with aggregated critical scores landing in a range typically reserved for films considered outright failures rather than merely disappointing. This harsh critical reception, combined with the film's failure to generate the kind of sustained audience enthusiasm needed to justify continued investment in additional Dark Universe films, ultimately led Universal to quietly abandon its ambitious shared universe plans almost as quickly as they had been announced, choosing instead to pivot towards smaller-scale, filmmaker-driven standalone projects built around its classic monster characters in the years that followed, a dramatically different creative direction than the interconnected blockbuster franchise model The Mummy had originally been built to launch. Looking back at the full scope of what went into making The Mummy, from its enormous 9-figure production budget and its star-driven insistence on practical zero-gravity stunt work aboard a specialized aircraft normally reserved for astronaut training, to the genuinely warm and often quite funny camaraderie that developed among its cast members even amid grueling stunt sequences and remote international filming locations, the production stands as a fascinating example of just how much time, money, and physical risk goes into creating even a single modern blockbuster, regardless of how that film ultimately performs once it finally reaches audiences in theaters. The stories that have emerged from the set in the years since its release, from Jake Johnson's memorable exchange with Cruise about the difference between being hurt and being injured, to the shared laughter among Boutella, Johnson, and Wallis reflecting on their stunt-filled shoot together, to the sheer physical endurance required of an entire film crew willing to spend 2 full days repeatedly experiencing genuine weightlessness aboard a plane nicknamed for its tendency to make people sick. Reveal a production that, whatever its ultimate financial and critical fate, clearly demanded an extraordinary level of commitment, humor, and resilience from everyone involved in bringing this ambitious vision of a shared monster universe to the screen. The Mummy 2017 Cultural and Historical Background. To fully appreciate The Mummy from 2017, it helps enormously to understand the deep well of history, mythology, and cinematic tradition that the film was drawing from, reshaping, and in many cases departing from entirely. This is a film that borrows its central imagery from thousands of years of genuine ancient Egyptian religious practice, filters that imagery through nearly a full century of Hollywood monster movie tradition, and ultimately positions the entire project within a very specific and, as it turned out, short-lived moment in the modern film industry when nearly every major studio was racing to build its own interconnected cinematic universe. Understanding each of these layers individually helps explain not only where the film's ideas came from, but also why certain choices were made and why the finished product turned out the way it did. At the very foundation of the story lies the ancient Egyptian practice of mummification itself, a real and extensively documented funerary tradition that formed a central pillar of ancient Egyptian religious belief for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians believed deeply in the concept of an afterlife, and more specifically, they believed that preserving the physical body after death was essential to ensuring a person's spirit, or ka, could continue to exist and be sustained in the world beyond death. This belief drove the development of an elaborate and highly ritualized embalming process carried out primarily by trained priests, who removed the body's internal organs, since decomposition of these organs was believed to threaten the body's ability to serve as a vessel for the spirit in the next life. The brain was typically removed and discarded, as ancient Egyptians did not fully understand its function and did not consider it important to preserve, while other major organs such as the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were carefully removed, dried, and stored separately in specialized ceremonial containers known as canopic jars, each traditionally associated with a particular protective deity. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was typically left in place within the body, since it was considered essential for judgment in the afterlife, when Egyptian belief held that the heart would be weighed against the feather of the goddess Ma'at to determine whether the deceased was worthy of entering paradise. Following the removal of these organs, the body itself was treated with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound that drew moisture out of the tissue and helped prevent decomposition, a drying process that could take upwards of 40 days to complete. Once sufficiently dried, the body was anointed with a variety of oils and resins meant both to preserve the skin and to honor the deceased, before finally being wrapped in many layers of linen bandages, often with protective amulets, and inscribed prayers tucked between the layers to guide and protect the spirit on its journey into the afterlife. This entire process, so central to the plot of The Mummy, was reserved primarily for royalty, nobility, and individuals of significant social or religious standing, since the materials, expertise, and time required made full mummification an extremely costly and labor-intensive undertaking unavailable to the vast majority of ordinary ancient Egyptians. The film's central villain, Ahmanet, draws heavily on real elements of Egyptian religious belief while also taking significant creative liberties in service of its horror and action narrative. The god she pledges herself to, Set, was indeed a genuine and significant deity within the actual ancient Egyptian pantheon, associated primarily with chaos, storms, violence, and the harsh unpredictability of the desert itself. In authentic Egyptian mythology, Set holds a considerably more complicated position than the straightforwardly evil figure depicted in the film. While he is famously remembered in Egyptian myth for murdering his brother Osiris in a bid for power, an act of betrayal that echoes thematically with Ahmanet's own murder of her father in the film, Set was not universally regarded as a purely malevolent force throughout the entirety of ancient Egyptian history. during certain periods, particularly earlier dynasties, Set was actually worshipped as a protector deity associated with strength and the ability to fend off chaos from beyond Egypt's borders, and he was sometimes depicted riding alongside the sun god Ra to help defend against the serpent of chaos each night. It was only in later periods of Egyptian history, particularly following political upheavals in which foreign invaders were associated with Set worship, that his reputation shifted more decisively toward an embodiment of pure evil and disorder, the version of the god that clearly informed the film's decision to cast him as an ancient evil force seeking to manifest physically in the modern world. The film's depiction of Ahmanet being denied her birthright as pharaoh due to the birth of a male heir also reflects a genuine, though more nuanced, historical reality. While ancient Egypt was in fact one of the few ancient civilizations to occasionally place women in positions of supreme political power, with historical figures such as Hatshepsut and Cleopatra serving as legitimate and often highly successful rulers of Egypt in their own right, succession customs still generally favored male heirs when one was available, meaning that a daughter's claim to the throne could indeed be displaced by the birth of a son, exactly as depicted in Ahmanet's tragic backstory within the film. Beyond its use of genuine mythological and religious material, The Mummy also positions itself as the latest entry in a much longer cinematic tradition stretching back nearly a full century into the earliest days of American horror filmmaking. The very first Mummy film produced by Universal Pictures was released all the way back in 1932, featuring the legendary horror actor Boris Karloff in the role of Imhotep, an ancient Egyptian high priest resurrected in the modern world after being discovered by a team of archaeologists. That original film, directed by Karl Freund, was itself deeply influenced by the enormous public fascination surrounding the real-life 1922 discovery of the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun by archaeologist Howard Carter, an event that captured global headlines and sparked what became known as Egyptomania, a widespread cultural obsession with ancient Egyptian history, art, and mythology that swept through Western popular culture throughout the 1920s. The original 1932 film told a story quite different from the 2017 reboot in many key respects, following Imhotep as he searches for the reincarnated soul of his lost love rather than the vengeful, power-hungry figure at the center of Ahmanet's story. Though both films share the same fundamental premise of an ancient Egyptian figure returning from death to pursue an obsession that has survived thousands of years of burial. Following the success of that original film, Universal continued mining the concept throughout the 1940s, introducing an entirely different mummy character named Kharis across a series of lower-budget sequels, before the franchise eventually descended into outright comedy territory with the 1955 film Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, marking a significant tonal shift away from the character's original horror roots. The franchise then lay largely dormant for several decades until Universal made the decision to revive it once again in 1999, this time reimagining the entire concept as a large-scale action-adventure blockbuster rather than a traditional horror film. That 1999 version, starring Brendan Fraser as an adventurous American soldier of fortune and featuring Arnold Vosloo as a returning incarnation of Imhotep, proved to be an enormous commercial success, spawning both a direct sequel in 2001's The Mummy Returns and eventually a third installment in 2008. Along with an animated spin-off series and a poorly received prequel film centered on a separate character called the Scorpion King. This late 1990s and early 2000s version of the franchise leaned heavily into swashbuckling adventure elements clearly inspired by earlier successful action-adventure films, blending horror imagery with a much lighter, more comedic and romantic tone that helped it appeal to a broader mainstream audience than the more atmospheric and slow-paced original 1932 film had ever attempted to reach. It was against the backdrop of this established cinematic history, spanning nearly 90 years and multiple dramatically different tonal approaches to the same basic monster, that Universal made the decision in the mid-2010s to attempt yet another reinvention of the property, this time with considerably higher stakes attached to its success or failure than any previous version of the franchise had ever carried. Those higher stakes were directly tied to a broader trend sweeping through the American film industry during the years leading up to the 2017 film's production, a trend largely inspired by the extraordinary financial success Marvel Studios had achieved by building an interconnected cinematic universe across multiple individual superhero franchises, all eventually converging into shared team-up films that generated billions of dollars in worldwide box office revenue. Watching Marvel's remarkable success unfold throughout the early 2010s, virtually every other major Hollywood studio began scrambling to identify their own valuable intellectual property that could potentially be reorganized into a similar interconnected franchise model, hoping to replicate even a fraction of the sustained commercial success this approach had delivered for Marvel and its parent company. Universal Pictures found itself in a particularly advantageous position in this regard, since the studio already possessed one of the richest and most historically significant libraries of classic horror characters found anywhere in the American film industry, having originated iconic cinematic monsters including Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolf Man, the Invisible Man, the creature from the Black Lagoon, and of course the Mummy itself, all dating back to the studio's celebrated run of horror classics throughout the 1930s and 1940s. This deep well of established, culturally recognizable characters seemed to offer Universal a uniquely promising foundation for building its own shared cinematic universe, one that could theoretically draw on nearly a century of built-in audience familiarity and nostalgia while still offering enough creative flexibility to reimagine these classic characters for contemporary audiences accustomed to the scale and spectacle of modern blockbuster filmmaking. This ambitious plan, which Universal formally branded as the Dark Universe, was intended to launch with The Mummy in 2017 before expanding into standalone films centered on other classic monster characters, with reports at the time indicating that Universal had already lined up major stars to potentially headline these future installments, including plans that would have seen Javier Bardem take on the role of Frankenstein's monster and Johnny Depp portray the Invisible Man in later films within the shared continuity. The film's marketing itself explicitly nodded toward this larger ambition, adopting the tagline "A New World of Gods and Monsters," a phrase deliberately borrowed from the classic 1935 Universal film Bride of Frankenstein, one of the most celebrated and influential entries in the studio's original run of horror classics from the 1930s. This direct reference was clearly intended to signal continuity and reverence for the studio's classic monster heritage while simultaneously promising audiences an entirely new, modernized approach to that same rich mythology, an approach built around large-scale action set pieces, a secretive monster hunting organization called Prodigium, and appearances from other classic characters such as Dr. Jekyll, all clearly designed to plant seeds for numerous future installments regardless of how well or poorly the initial film performed on its own individual merits. Unfortunately for Universal, the finished film's heavy emphasis on franchise building ultimately worked against it in ways that became a defining talking point in discussions of the movie following its release. Because so much of the film's narrative energy was devoted to establishing Prodigium, introducing Dr. Jekyll's dual nature, and hinting at other monsters and future storylines still to come, many critics and audiences alike felt that the story of Ahmanet herself, arguably the most emotionally compelling and narratively coherent element the film had to offer, was ultimately shortchanged in favor of laying groundwork for sequels that, as history would eventually reveal, were never actually going to materialize in the way Universal had originally envisioned. This particular criticism reflected a broader pattern that emerged across the film industry during this period, as numerous studios attempting to hastily construct their own shared universes in the wake of Marvel's success often found that audiences responded far more strongly to well-crafted individual stories with clear emotional stakes than they did to films that felt more like extended advertisements for future franchise installments. The Mummy's disappointing critical and commercial reception, following so closely on the heels of similarly ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful shared universe attempts by other studios during this same general period, contributed to a broader industry-wide reassessment of the shared universe model, with many studios subsequently scaling back their most ambitious interconnected franchise plans in favor of more contained, standalone storytelling approaches better suited to the specific characters and properties involved, rather than forcing every major property into an interconnected universe format regardless of whether that particular approach actually served the material well. Beyond its place within Hollywood's franchise-building trends, The Mummy also arrived at an interesting cultural moment in terms of how Western popular culture engages with depictions of ancient Egypt and the broader Middle East more generally. The practice of Western storytellers drawing on Egyptian and broader Middle Eastern imagery, often filtered through a lens shaped more by Western fantasy and adventure tropes than by rigorous historical or cultural accuracy, has a long and complicated history stretching back well over a century, closely tied to the broader colonial-era fascination with what was often referred to at the time as the exotic Orient. This pattern, sometimes referred to by scholars using the term Orientalism, involves Western media repeatedly depicting the Middle East and North Africa through a narrow set of familiar tropes, often centered around ancient curses, forbidden tombs, exotic mysticism, and dangerous supernatural forces waiting to be unleashed by unsuspecting Western explorers or soldiers. The Mummy franchise across all of its various incarnations, including the 2017 version, has often been discussed within this broader cultural context, given its consistent reliance on the basic premise of Western protagonists, whether they be British archaeologists in the 1932 version or an American soldier in the 2017 version, stumbling upon ancient Egyptian dangers that local populations and traditions had worked for centuries to keep safely contained. This narrative structure, while certainly effective for generating suspense and adventure within the confines of a commercial entertainment film, has prompted ongoing conversations among film scholars and cultural critics about how Western popular entertainment has historically tended to position Egypt and the broader Middle East primarily as an exotic backdrop for the adventures of Western characters, rather than centering the perspectives, histories, and agency of the region's own people and traditions in these stories. It is worth noting, in fairness to the 2017 film specifically, that The Mummy does make certain choices that distinguish it somewhat from earlier and more overtly colonial framings of similar material. Rather than centering British colonial archaeologists working within a clearly imperial framework, as the original 1932 film did quite explicitly, the 2017 version instead frames its protagonist as a morally compromised American soldier engaged in decidedly illegal black market smuggling of antiquities. A framing that at least implicitly acknowledges some of the ethically fraught history surrounding Western removal and exploitation of Middle Eastern and North African cultural artifacts, even if the film ultimately does not explore this dimension of its premise in any significant depth. Additionally, the film's decision to make Ahmanet herself a genuinely sympathetic, tragic figure whose villainous transformation stems directly from legitimate grievances around denied inheritance and patriarchal succession customs represents a somewhat more nuanced approach to its central antagonist than many earlier entries in the broader mummy horror subgenre, which more frequently depicted their resurrected Egyptian villains as straightforwardly monstrous threats without significant interior emotional complexity or clearly articulated motivation rooted in relatable human grievances such as betrayal and stolen birthright. The film's setting also intersects with genuine and significant historical realities surrounding the modern history of Iraq, the country where the story's opening sequences take place. By setting its inciting incident within a present-day American military operation in Iraq, The Mummy inevitably invokes, even if only as convenient narrative backdrop rather than serious political commentary, the very real and highly significant history of American military involvement in Iraq throughout the early 21st century. Following the 2003 invasion and the lengthy military presence that continued in various forms throughout the years that followed, The film's decision to open with American soldiers operating within Iraq, engaged in activities including calling in airstrikes and conducting operations that inadvertently unearth ancient historical sites, reflects a broader pattern common throughout modern American action and adventure filmmaking, in which recent and ongoing American military engagements in the Middle East frequently serve as convenient settings for launching supernatural or fantastical narratives, even when the films themselves generally avoid engaging directly with the more serious political, humanitarian, and historical dimensions of those actual military conflicts. This pattern reflects a broader tendency within mainstream commercial filmmaking to draw on real-world settings and conflicts primarily for their capacity to generate immediate dramatic tension and visual spectacle, rather than as opportunities for deeper political or historical engagement with the actual complexities and consequences of the conflicts being referenced. A tendency that applies just as readily to The Mummy's use of an Iraqi setting as it does to countless other action films that have similarly used recent Middle Eastern conflicts as convenient backdrops for their opening sequences. The film's broader thematic engagement with questions of gender, power, and inheritance also deserves consideration within its historical and cultural context. Ahmanet's central grievance, having her rightful claim to the Egyptian throne stripped away purely because her father eventually fathered a son with another wife, taps into a theme with genuine historical resonance across numerous ancient, and even more recent human societies, in which patrilineal succession customs have frequently prioritized male heirs over female heirs regardless of birth order or individual merit and capability. While ancient Egypt was, as mentioned earlier, historically somewhat more open to female rule than many other ancient civilizations, with legitimate and celebrated female pharaohs including Hatshepsut ruling successfully in their own right, the broader pattern of male preference in succession customs depicted in Ahmanet's backstory reflects a genuine historical reality that extended across countless cultures and centuries well beyond ancient Egypt specifically. This theme of a woman denied legitimate power and driven toward increasingly extreme measures in response to that injustice carries a certain enduring resonance that helps explain why many viewers and critics identified Ahmanet's story as one of the film's more compelling elements, even as the broader film surrounding her origin story struggled to fully capitalize on this potentially rich thematic material amid its competing obligations to franchise building and large-scale action spectacle. Finally, it is worth situating The Mummy within the broader historical arc of Egyptology itself, the scholarly discipline devoted to the study of ancient Egyptian history, language, art, and culture, which formally emerged as a serious academic field following Napoleon Bonaparte's military campaign in Egypt at the very end of the 18th century. That campaign, though primarily a military and political undertaking, notably included a team of scholars and scientists tasked with documenting Egypt's ancient monuments and artifacts, an effort that led directly to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, the crucial artifact that eventually allowed scholars to finally decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing after centuries of these ancient inscriptions remaining largely unreadable to the modern world. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Egyptology developed into an increasingly rigorous academic discipline, even as it remained closely entangled with the broader colonial-era practices of European powers excavating, and in many cases removing, vast quantities of ancient Egyptian artifacts for display in European and American museums. A historical legacy that remains the subject of ongoing debate and repatriation discussions between modern Egypt and various Western institutions holding significant collections of Egyptian antiquities to this day. The enormous public fascination generated by Howard Carter's 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's largely intact tomb represented something of a cultural high watermark for popular interest in ancient Egyptian history, an event that directly inspired the original wave of mummy-themed entertainment throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Including the very first Universal mummy film in 1932 that eventually led, through nearly a full century of subsequent reinterpretation and reinvention, to the version of The story that Tom Cruise and his fellow cast members brought to the screen in 2017. Understanding this long chain of historical influence, stretching from genuine ancient Egyptian religious practice through the colonial-era birth of modern Egyptology, into nearly a century of Hollywood monster movie tradition, and finally into the specific commercial pressures of a film industry racing to replicate Marvel's shared universe success, provides valuable context for appreciating just how many different historical and cultural threads ultimately converge to produce this particular film, regardless of how audiences and critics ultimately judge the finished result upon its release in the summer of 2017. If you enjoyed learning about the cultural and historical background behind The Mummy from 2017, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow movie lovers who enjoy exploring the deeper history behind their favorite films, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next full breakdown of your favorite films.